Welcome back. Our topic tonight was a discussion on school choice and education in the state of New York. Our guests are Santo Albano and Frank Russo. And as we were leaving off at the halfway point, we had made a number of different opinions here, and I think a number of points were established. And I think, in fairness, Santo, you mentioned that the state of New York, in terms of public school, has to cover all the requirements for all the children, and you felt that that was a distinguishing feature. But I think Frank brought up a number of points that cost-benefit analysis, coupled with the fact that there is demand out there for this product by the parents, is a very important topic. And Frank, to that point, one of the concerns, I think, is the mission of public schools has been to educate students with regards to citizenship and respect for our Constitution. Are private schools able to perform this function as well as public schools?
You know, I find it so interesting to even hear that question, because the answer is so obviously yes. Anyone who's got any experience with private schools knows that. Paul Peterson of Harvard University, Jay Green of the University of Arkansas, Terry Moe, Eric Hanuschak, Caroline Hoxby, all these experts from prestigious universities studying educational issues have studied this. I'm just going to give a quote from what they've said, these experts. School choice strengthens democratic values as choice enhances racial integration and tolerance of ethnic, racial, and religious differences. They're more likely to promote social involvement. You know, there's a lot of problems nowadays with bigotry. We often talk about, the Christians who are exhibiting anti-Semitic biases. We rarely talk about Jewish bigotry against Christians, but that's also a problem. Bigotry of blacks against whites, whites against blacks, and so forth. But some results have been studied by Gallup and polls on this. One study I remember goes back a good 20 years or so, in which he looked at Catholic students in public schools and their degree of anti-Semitism versus Catholic students in Catholic schools. And surprisingly, and I always like to tell this to my Jewish friends because they have an erroneous, they're thinking the opposite. The degree of anti-Semitism was higher amongst the Catholic students in the public schools than in the Catholic schools. Catholic schools and religious schools in general, Jewish schools, they do I think, at least as good a job. I personally think they do a better job in promoting these kind of values. That's my opinion.
That's fascinating. I never heard that before. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I'm surprised. I'm actually happy. If it's really true that they've done a study and they found that Catholic students in parochial schools are actually less anti-Semitic than others, that's remarkable because, as Frank
Gallup.
Well, I'm willing to accept it, but I want to also
taken back by it.
Explain my feeling about it, and that that's a traumatic change, because anyone who has any slight knowledge of history and the history of the Catholic Church, they invented anti-Semitism, they nurtured anti-Semitism, and that's what I heard when I was in Catholic school. So if that's changing, that's a good change.
Well,
I agree.
I would have to disagree with that. I'm a product of Catholic education my entire life. I never heard anything anti-Semitic. But you raised one very good point about...
I would add, I'm also a complete Catholically educated student as well, grammar, high school, and college. And in fact, I'll go so far to give my alma mater, Villanova University, a plug, which was, we were taught early on in theology class that if Jesus was to reappear, he would be very likely to visit the synagogue and not necessarily Catholic Church. But to that point, I agree, there may have been, listen, everybody has participated in the shortcomings of society.
Right.
I think it's fair to hold Catholics responsible,
Sure.
and private institutions. But your point, Santo, you were going to follow up.
Well, you have a question, I think you have a...
Yeah, you had a question.
Well, I
can
was
go
going to comment on your point that it's better for parents to be more involved, and you said that it's easier for a school to educate a child where there's parental involvement. And of course, everyone can agree that parental involvement in any area of a child's life, the child's going to benefit from that. But when Frank was talking about this trend of parents to become more involved when they've had a choice, I hadn't heard that, and it makes sense to me, and it kind of made me think of the comparison between people who rent versus people who own. When you own your home, you've made the decision and you want to take better care of it. You have a vested interest in it. But I have to differ with you on saying that the Catholic schools choose which students. My son, who's now 15 and goes to Chaminade, he went to grammar school in Catholic school. It was just a matter of enrolling him. And with Chaminade, there's simply a test. And I think that's the way it is with most of the Catholic high schools. There's an entrance exam. They're not meeting the child. They don't know where the child comes from. It's an anonymous test. They don't know the last name. They don't know the town they're coming from. He has students in his class that are very, very wealthy. He has another friend in the freshman class who lives in a 2-bedroom, 3rd-floor apartment in Queens. And his father works at a gas station. I don't know if they get financial aid or not, but they're a Polish family. They've made a lot of sacrifices for their children to go to a Catholic school. And it's simply a matter of passing the test.
See, I think you name a public school where there's an entrance exam. That's a selection an entrance exam is a selection criteria. They want a certain score on that exam.
Okay.
So the person, your child probably did well.
Yes, but I
So he
understand.
got
I
selected
hear
in.
your point, but you're saying that they select out for behavior and for income, and that definitely isn't happening, at least in my experience with the Catholic schools. But I think an area I want to get into that Frank kind of touched on is the main reason that parents want their child to go to a parochial school or a private school isn't just because they want to feel that they chose it. That's part of it. A parent doesn't want their child to just go to the local school because that's the nearest school, and their school district has decided, okay, you live in Franklin Square, so your child's going to the Franklin Square public schools. They want to choose any local school, including the private, and the reason is for moral values. I think there's a remarkable difference in the upbringing of a child that goes to a parochial school versus a public school. I know when I was briefly considering a public high school for my son, and I went to the local public high school, one of the first things I noticed was a huge poster hanging in the hallway outside the guidance department for condoms. And I walked out, and that's when I decided my choice has ended. But how do you respond to parents who say that their child is in public school because right now they can't afford to fund private school tuition, but they see that their child is not, they're not getting the values of the private school?
Well, I want to answer 2 ways. The whole values issue thing is an interesting thing. But I'm going to answer this. You're pointing out what obviously is probably a problem for parents within the public school system, that they can't get to choose what they deem to be the better public school.
Exactly.
So the effort should be to solve it within the system, not to take money away from the system and go fund a separate system altogether. It's very common, with all due respect, for people who send their children to religious schools to think that their kids are more moral than kids in public schools. It ain't so. The studies will show that. It wasn't so when I went to parochial school. They did the same thing. They robbed from the poor box. They did all kinds of things, but they were viewed as the holy ones. I was viewed as one of the holy ones, but I've always had this sort of point of suffering for me because I could see beyond the PR. Parochial schools are great with the public relations, and they send them. Now we wear uniforms and ties and coats. We're gentlemen, but you got criminals, you got this and that. Frank knows it. I think you know it too. The Catholic Church, as an example of one religious hierarchy, is a large organization. Okay, but you got pedophiles. Now, as Frank rightfully argues, that doesn't mean all the priests and nuns are, but some of them are. So what was so magical about the religious education?
Well,
Because they weren't able to, they didn't deal with it.
Well, I want to focus the
Yeah.
topic back on choice and education. And
Right.
we need to kind of have a couple of things here in
Yeah.
respect.
Sure.
Because you bring up some issues, but in terms of, let's
Well,
be
can I
fair.
let me
There's
respond to this.
48,000 Catholic priests in the
Right.
country, in the United
Right.
States. Less than 800 were involved in pedophilia.
Right.
There's a large percentage of good people dedicated in the Catholic school system, and it's an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise distinguished period of service in this country that
Right.
Catholics all share in.
Mike,
But-
I would
but we wanna
appreciate it,
get
because
back to
I
the
want to keep
point.
it between
Right.
us two,
Right.
rather than having you guys get involved, otherwise it's not going to be fair to Santo. And I appreciate Santo coming on.
I'm okay with unfairness. I get
No, I mean, and Santo, I got to know Santo back after he saw some of our shows, disagreed with me. He wrote me an email, and he signed himself the Cranky Atheist. He is not cranky in any way. I got to love Santo. When he came over, he was kind enough to come over and visit me at my home. He's the most charming gentleman I could find, and I'm glad to meet someone like this. What I want to say is a bunch of points. And by the way, on the abuse problem, just to put everything in perspective, which is I think maybe where Mike was going, there are 11,000 cases of sexual abuse over 50 years in the Catholic Church, Santo. I don't know if you know these data, but it comes to roughly 200, 220 victims per year of abuse in the Catholic Church. It wasn't all reported, but this is how many we believe occurred. In the public schools, I don't know if you know what the number is, how many, this is per Dr. Cheryl Shakeshaft of Hofstra University Education Department, did the study for the U.S. Department of Education, released in June of '04. It's not 200 cases of child sexual abuse, as in the Catholic Church per year, it's 29,000
Right.
victims of child. When you proportion it amongst the teachers versus the number of priests, it still comes out to be roughly, in my calculations, twice as much abuse by public school teachers and employees than by priests and religious in the Catholic Church. No, you don't talk about that. That's because what I view as the bias in the media. But the numbers, the facts are there. This comes from the American Association of University Women studies, which constitute a large part of the basis of Dr. Shakeshaft's research. But I don't want to get off onto that. No, I mean, in all honesty, you have a different view of the Catholic Church. I don't want to.
I mentioned that, Frank, because I know what you believe on, and I don't. And this show is not
Not
about
on
that.
that.
But I mentioned that because, as the moderator pointed out, oh, there's only like 800, and that small percentage, any group. Well, why isn't it then when you think of unions and teachers, don't you have the same attitude? Yeah, there's some 300 clunkers in the system, but most of them are good teachers. But based on the 300 clunkers that you can't fire, he wants to throw out the whole system. I'm not saying that about it's a different context.
Well, I would just say,
I don't want to get.
and
I really want to keep you guys
I
out
want
of
to
it.
get back to,
Yeah.
to some of the questions that we have, but before
Good.
you had alluded to some studies that show that there was no benefit, morally speaking, or difference between the two groups, and I would say that that's
Right.
there's
Here's my key
competing
point.
thoughts on that.
My key point on this question, which I think is an important question on the moral values, you wanted it, I think it's
Yeah.
an important question to be asked, is this. 50, 60 years ago, the public schools never got into certain controversial issues such as killing one's unborn child, abortion, the issue of homosexuality, which is a major topic now, the issue of premarital sex. And, well, we know you're going to have sex, and so since you're going to have sex, you shouldn't have it. Better to not to abstain, but we know you're going to, so here are the condoms, as Patty. These are very controversial subjects that parents should care more about. Unfortunately, so many parents are so busy working two jobs and both parents working that they don't always get into this. But in view of the change in how our schools are discussing these very controversial subjects, and in light of the fact that the public schools, because of various court decisions, must take what I would call a secular humanist position on all these subjects. They cannot have prayers in school, and I agree with that. It's a public school, you can't have a prayer. But there are many parents who think, gee, saying a prayer might affect how my child thinks about certain issues. Knowing the 10 Commandments might affect how my child's going to behave on certain key moral issues, stealing, hurting someone else, getting angry, having sex, obeying a parent. These are values that the parent has to be able to control. And by picking a school where you're free to say a prayer that the parent approves of, to me is a basic, I don't want to pay extra money for this, but at all times I make it clear that if you pick a school other than the public school, and by the way, special needs kids, I favor them getting the full amount, whatever school they pick, private or public, they should get the full amount. If you're in the 85% or 90% of the pupils that are not special needs, though, then I favor giving the public school kids more money, roughly 50% more money than the private school kids. But I want to give them something. They're getting nothing now. The parents are getting nothing, and this is killing the low-income and middle-income parents, especially minority parents, African-American, Hispanic parents, poor white parents. You look at the Long Island school districts of Wyandanch and Hempstead and all these minority school districts. You said the public schools don't get to choose. Well, the parent is choosing by virtue of where he chooses to live. And so, in effect, the wealthy do have choice. It's the middle income and low income who are denied choice. And what school choice, the issue of school choice does is it empowers all parents, not only the wealthy who today have choice, it empowers the middle income and the poor parent, and the minority parents especially. They don't want to continue this racial preference nonsense, because then when a black gets promoted or a black gets a job that over the whites, people are going to say, oh, he got the job because he's black or because it was a woman. You eliminate that when you go to choice, because then you're giving the blacks a fair educational opportunity, which they are not getting today, nor are the Hispanics, nor are the poor whites. Choice empowers the parent, it empowers the student, It's a basic principle of American society, how anyone could oppose it.
So
blows my-
doesn't that
And with the
position-
moral values, just to conclude, with the moral values that are taught in the public school today, condoning homosexuality, condoning premarital sex by virtue of giving them condoms, these are messages that are abhorrent to many parents.
They're mocking what the
They're-
parent is
that's
trying
right.
to do at
And,
home.
and silence teaches another point. Mario Cuomo made. By not saying prayers, that sends a message that God's not important. And if a parent doesn't believe in God, you're an atheist, that's fine. You're a wonderful person still. You have a right to pick a school that reaffirms that atheistic viewpoint or that agnostic viewpoint. But a parent who believes in God should have a right to pick a school that reaffirms his or her sets of social values or religious values without getting any extra money for that, just half as much as the public school kid gets. And you could pick a witches school if you want. You can pick a secular school if you want, or a religious school. You should be able to pick any school you want that meets the basic requirements of the state regarding math, history, English, or science. Yeah, the biggest opponents of this are the teacher unions who want to continue. By the way, their salaries, Sandro made a point about their salaries that they barely could, afford a living. In Port Washington, the median salary is $100,000 a year for the teachers in our school district. That's the median salary. Half are making more, half less.
Right.
They're making more than the market calls for. The market says we got 5,000 applicants for 20 jobs in Port Washington.
That says something.
That says we don't have to pay these salaries. The unions are robbing the taxpayers. We've got a choice. We'll deal with that problem by cutting the costs, empowering the parents, and benefiting the taxpayers.
Well, this interesting, this prayer in school business. The religious children who are going to public school have no problem praying to Allah, praying to Jehovah, praying to Jesus. What the public school, because they want to be faithful to the Constitution of the United States, it's not the Bible that's the guiding book, it's the Constitution of the United States, and that is their separation of church and state.
But
So
aren't
the
they now opening
teachers,
public schools in New York City that are Muslim-based?
well, I think there were 1 and 2. I think they make mistakes. I think doing that is equal to, it's the same mistake that the voucher programs would do. It gets the government into supporting religious institutions, and where that's going to go, I think religionists just, they're being naive. They're being naive, because we've tried that.
And I agree with separation of church and state. I don't want the government picking the schools. I want the parent to pick the school as long as it meets the requirements of the state regarding math, English, history, science.
I know, but you're playing a kind of subtle game to circumvent the reality. Since most people are religious, I'm in a minority, although it's a large one. In the United States, about 30 million atheists. The vast majority of people are religious. You give them money, they're going to choose religious schools.
Maybe if they think it's doing a better job for their child. I think polls do show, Santo, the majority of especially poor parents and middle-income parents, yes, would choose a private religious school because they're unhappy with the educational quality. I'm saddened by the fact that they're not concerned about the moral values that are not being taught or the wrong values that are being taught in the public school. I'm sorry that that's not part of their thinking. The basic reasoning of most parents that want to go to private schools, as all polls show, Gallup and others, the Pew polls as well, they're showing that the parents are concerned about the educational quality. The public schools are failing too many students in educational quality. And it's killing the taxpayers in New York State. We're spending $20,000 a pupil. In Long Island, even more than $20,000 per pupil. It's killing the taxpayers, and it's failing too many students.
Well, I think you
I
raised
think
a good point.
Okay, sorry.
If I could just
Sure.
mention, Santa, maybe you could respond. You said that there's no reason to throw out the current educational system. We should work with what we have. But Frank raises the point that there's so much money going at the public education system, and it's not getting better. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think because the religious community is trying to get taxpayer money for their schools, in their rhetoric and in their argumentation, it makes sense. You have to argue that the public schools are failing. And I don't understand how that happens, because like every few years there's the International Science Contest, and 99% of the kids who are finalists and the ones who win tend to come from public schools. This past year was only one student from Chaminade who got in the final. Congratulations to Chaminade. So how is the public school failing so greatly? I think what's hidden in that is that Frank wants the 10 Commandments in there. And I would argue that the 10 Commandments has very little morality in it.
Well,
the 10
this-
Commandments are mostly about the relationship between humans and a powerful God. The only one, the only one that has a more, thou shalt not kill. Although if you read the Bible and whatnot, Jehovah was a great killer.
My point, Santos, my basic point is not, I don't want to impose anyone's, I don't like people imposing their will on others.
Right.
Today, the secularists, the atheists, the agnostics, in effect, are imposing their will on the religious people
Well,
by virtue of collecting our money and saying, unless you pick our secular school where we cannot pray, where we will teach these secular humanist values, unless you pick that school, you get none of your money back. I don't want your money. I just want to, even if we're allowed to keep our own money, get a tax rebate, a tax credit.
Well, it
I'm saying
depends
that who should make the choice on what's, this is the question I wanted to
Yeah.
pose to you. I know you're going to give me a question if we have the time. But the question,
do.
who should be the ultimate person making the choice to pick your child's school? Should it be the parent or the government? Today it's the government. I say, why should it not be the parent?
Well, let me tell you what my training was in terms of how to be a good citizen of America. That when I pay taxes that fund the public school, I'm not just paying taxes to fund my children. I'm paying taxes to fund the education of all American kids. So I don't see it as I'm losing my money.
How do you feel towards Social Security? You pay Social Security taxes. If
Right.
I'm getting my Social Security payment, if I put it in my church basket, do you object? I pay Medicare. If I pick
No,
a
you-
Catholic hospital or a Jewish hospital, is there anything wrong with me picking a hospital that might have a religious symbol on it? The scholarships, the college scholarships, the Pell Grants, you can pick a Catholic or Jewish or Protestant college and use government money. As long as you're not getting more because you pick that religious school than you pick if you pick a secular college, why should you not be free as a person, as a citizen of this country? You're paying taxes, you should be free to pick whatever you want so long as it meets the basic requirements set by the state regarding the secular subjects of math, history, English, science, and the arts.
Yeah, but see, here's where you don't. I don't think you
Okay.
understand that when the tax dollars flow, there's always curriculum debate. Now, you know, I've discussed it with you. I happen to think that there ought to be religion in the public schools, but in this way, call them comparative religion. So the kids study different kinds of religions, the pros and the cons, when they began, what people think they get from them. So I want that in there. But I also want human sexuality education because, as you know, I've said, both the secular community and the religious community are fundamentally ignorant about it. And we need a lot of dialogue about it. I like us, you've heard me say that we should join up to try to reduce the amount of abortions, but there's always this religious block, because I'm going to say it in a provocative way, that Christianity has always been fearful of human sexuality. They're almost the only group that thinks if you talk to a child about contraception, you give them permission to have sex and now they're going to have it. Mother Nature must laugh when she hears that, because Mother Nature wants the sex to happen. The question is, how do you get kids to be mature about it? So this values thing, I think, gets us way off. I think it's all about money, and I think it's okay that it be about money.
Can I just say one thing? Because you both hit on a topic, and I
Right.
think you're both coming at it from different
Right.
angles. You brought up the money. So, Santo, then speak to the community that supports the private schools, because they essentially pay twice for the community at large, but then they support the private school by paying for that on top
The
of that.
people I know, and it's a small sample because I don't know everybody, who send their kids to parochial schools don't want taxpayer money because they know what comes with it. There'll be pressure for human sexuality courses. There'll be pressure for this, pressure for that. There'll be rules about if the kids who are in there and they don't want to say the group prayer, they don't have to say it. So you start to get separation of people. You start to get the balkanization. They don't want it. They love separation of church of state, and they like it that it might cause them to have to hustle a little bit more to send their kid to that yeshiva or to send the kid to St. Anthony's. And yes, they feel a little annoyed by it, but they're willing to do it. They don't want the government involved.
Every poll I've seen shows that students benefit, and by the way, there's a great book called School Choice, The Findings. I'd just like to hold this up by Dr. Herbert Wahlberg. All sorts of educational professionals. Every study, not every study, I take that back. 90 to 95% of the studies show that students benefit, that the taxpayers benefit, and the parents benefit with choice. I don't disagree with a lot of what Santo's saying. He has his own views on what should be in a school. And I think people like him should get involved with the schools that they want to send their children to, get on the boards. promote those values and those methodologies. The state has a certain requirement, I think, to establish certain minimum requirements regarding math and English and writing and the sciences, and to have tests administered so that the parents are properly informed as to the quality of these non-public schools. So I agree with, I know Santo and I have discussed that, and I agree with him on that. But the basic issue is, who should decide where you send your children for a K-12 education? Colleges today, it's a pretty fairly done thing, and Pell scholarships, you can pick a Catholic college, a Jewish college, a Protestant college, a Muslim college. But in K-12, which is when the children's values are primarily being formed, today you're being pressured to pick the public school, 90% of the people are, because they can't afford the tuition, which is to account for only about a third of the cost of the public schools, because the costs of these private schools are way lower than the public schools. So it turns out that not only will the parent benefit, not only will the students benefit by virtue of by having the competition, which then forces the public schools now suddenly, if they're not going to perform in Wyandanch or Hempstead or the New York City schools or wherever, that parent has now got the wherewithal to take his child out of that school and put him into a private school, and that tuition will be covered 90 to 100% by the voucher, because the costs are much lower to begin with. The voucher is going to be set at something less than maybe half the cost of the public school education. Taxpayers who are overly burdened with property taxes are being murdered today, especially in the New York City suburbs of Long Island and Westchester and Orange. We will benefit tremendously by savings. My estimation, based on the study done by the New York State Senate in 1991, today those savings would be in the order of $10 billion a year. Everybody wins. Quality will go up because competition is good for everything, as John Stossel said over and over again with Stupid in America on ABC's 2020. Competition is what you need to empower the person who's making the decision of what to do. Today, 90% of the parents don't have any choice. They don't have the money to pay the tuition. They've got to pick the public school. If they can't afford a nice neighborhood, they're going to have to pick a neighborhood where the schools are very questionable and failing. Everyone would win, and the parent who also gets to reaffirm his or her values. If he wants a prayer said, he should be able to pick a school where they'll say a prayer. He's not going to get any extra money for it. He's only getting the money for math, English, history, and science. But if he wants a prayer said, they'll say the prayer. If someone else like Santo doesn't want any prayers, he wants no religion, fine, you pick the school, the public school or whatever, that will not do that. But why force this on all parents?
I think the force is coming from your side, not from our side.
Well, Frank
Yes.
makes an interesting point. I think you're both in agreement, though, that the best ticket out of poverty is an education.
Yes.
But in your opinion, who then are the major opponents of parental choice in education, and why are they so opposed to giving parents that basic right to choose their
Well,
school?
I come at it first. Who are the major opponents?
Yeah.
I think there are people who see the have a worldview that includes supernatural beings, and the existence of these supernatural beings helps them to feel moral and have values and to reduce their anxiety. And I'm not against it. Like Frank says, well, if people, if I want to go to create a secular school where there's no religion, I never say that. I'm against state-supported religion. So I'm against the teacher leading a group prayer to Jesus. But I'm not against a Christian kid sitting at the desk who feels anxious about the test and he wants to do a rosary. I don't think that we should stop that, because you have an individual right. It's a separation of church and state. The state makes no laws to impede religion. I have no problem with that. It's when I argue that your side is now trying to create a public institution that promotes a particular religion. I think we get into trouble because we've seen it before.
I don't want the government deciding anything. I want the government to empower the parent.
Parents aren't empowered.
They're not
most
empowered.
People, most people
parents
go to public
cannot.
schools because they want to.
Not because they want to, because they can't afford the tuition. Santos,
No,
poll after
no,
poll.
no,
Come on.
no.
Every poll shows if they had fully supported scholarships at half the level of a public school education, a majority, more than 50%, and I'm talking minority parents, it's 80 and 90%, they would pick a religious school. It
would
should
be
be
the-
up. I don't want the government picking anyone's religion. I don't want the government imposing religion. I want
But they
separation
would.
of church.
They would.
But I want the government, just as the Pell Grant allows a student to pick a religious college. Medicare, you can pick a religious hospital.
Right.
If you get Social Security checks from the government, you can give that money to your church or synagogue if you choose. That's not the government supporting religion. That's government empowering the parent. You want to impose your secular humanist views
called the
on the rest.
Constitution, Frank.
No, I'm for the Constitution.
It's called the
First Amendment
Constitution.
says the freedom,
Separation.
free exercise of religion. The second part is the government shall not establish religion, nor it will also guarantee the right to free exercise. You're denying religious people the right to free exercise. You're denying the second
No.
part of the First Amendment, basic right to parents, by forcing them to go to the public schools.
You're doing
I
what
guess
Stossel
Gentlemen,
does. He makes
gentlemen,
a fetish out of
we're
competition.
going to have to leave it there. Our guest tonight, the topic has been choice in education. Our guest was Mr. Albano and Frank Russo. And just before we go, Frank, if you could hold that book one more time so our
School
audience
Choice, The Findings by Dr. Herbert Wahlberg, all sorts of experts. It's very, very good, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to see it.
If you'd like more information, you can get information from United New Yorkers for Choice in Education, P.O. Box 4096, Hempstead, New York 11551, or call 516-292-1224. We thank you again for being with us tonight, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. The program was brought to you by the American Family Association of New York. If you'd like to receive AFA's free newsletter, write us at P.O. Box 203, Port Washington, New York 11050, or call us at 516-944-3544. Our newsletter and TV schedule are on our website at www.afany.org. Your comments are welcome, and thanks for being with us.